Welcome to my YouTube channel. My guest on Facing the Canon is Dan Morrice, an explorer and storyteller. Dan Morrice, welcome to Facing the Canon.
Thank you.
It's great to have you. I read Finding the Peacemakers, and I have to say, one of the most gripping, engaging books that I've read in a long time. Some great stories. You are, Dan, a storyteller.
That's
Have
right.
you always known that you could tell stories?
Well, I think the first thing I noticed is that stories grip me. So when you hear people sort of teaching or giving you advice or information, that's helpful to an extent. But when you get lost in a really good narrative, I find it inspires you. You know, if you see someone that's done something amazing, you see lives well lived, you think, I want something, I want what they've got. And so I think the stories always gripped me, and I love teaching through stories. It just kind of became, and I'm also just curious, I kind of want to know, what does it look like to be a peacemaker in this sort of environment? So I think curiosity has been my, probably my fuel on this adventure. And so that's why, and obviously when people ask you about a trip or something, it's the stories of a way you tell it. You don't come back and say, here's 5 things I've learnt. You say, let me tell you about this person.
Well, one of the stories, Dan, that you tell in the book is the story about the miners in Chile.
Yeah.
Now, first of all, it was a big story, but what prompted you to go to Chile to retell the story?
I thought there was something that we in the West weren't quite getting, the full picture. And so I think when the story broke, I was actually in London. I'm from Bristol originally, but I was visiting London. I was on the tube, which is not known as an environment of like sheer euphoria.
No.
It's just a morning commute, and normally people are a bit sleepy, but it was just a real sense of joy in the atmosphere. And it was the day when the miners were set free. It was all in the papers. There was miners with tears cutting through their cheeks, hugging the president, kissing their wives, high-fiving the drilling queue. It was such a warm and, like, you could sense in the atmosphere, even in the underground, people were just rejoicing. This is a good news story. And it just sort of lifted the atmosphere a little bit. And so I read, like everyone, I read into the story. I wanted to know what was really going on. And I think the papers sort of hinted at something within this story there was more to it than meets the eye. And so, in fact, the Times called it the miracle of San Jose. Yes. And there were certain events that happened within the mine during that 69-day ordeal that really were quite remarkable. Water that miraculously became clean, a breeze that swept out of nowhere and restored this guy's breathing in his last moments, and things like that. But because the secular press, understandably, is not used to this, don't quite know what to do, so they weren't sort of covering it up, but just didn't know what to do. Like, how would you describe someone who drops to their knees?
They didn't know how to explain it.
Exactly.
Yeah, they didn't have an understanding of maybe the supernatural.
Exactly. So I feel like the world needs to know the true story. I want to know the true story.
But then, so you reached out to one of the miners.
Yeah.
I mean, but you managed to find a connection somewhere.
Oh, that was God's providence, 100%.
Yes.
So I wrote to his publisher in the States and said, could you forward this letter on to Jose?
He was one of the senior miners, because he'd been mining for many years.
Yeah, he's one of the older ones,
Yeah, and he was used to rock falls and all sorts of things.
Yeah.
So he had quite an influence over all the other miners.
He really did, yeah. And I think sort of like a father figure, like you say, because he'd endured real challenges before, but he really kept his faith in it. So he wasn't just someone who had had experience, he was someone who knew that God's protected us before. And he's kind of walked that road of praying daily, of having real faith, and he had that real trust, that real peace. And so when the mine first collapsed, and he just said, look, this is an opportunity to trust God, to look after one another. He had a real, just a really good Christ-like sort of attitude, and the others in that panic kind of said, can you help us out here? Like, you seem to have something that we don't have. And so he became a sort of, like a real sort of role model to them, really, like a sort of big brother that looked after them. And there are others as well, but Jose, they just noticed something spiritual about him. So he started leading prayers, he sort of would make them forgive each other when there was a little bit of fraction. And he became, and they called him the pastor. He wasn't a pastor, but he became that sort of pastoral figure, and he really held them together. And a lot of them later, when I interviewed, said, Jose kept us together.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Now, so obviously you need water, you need food.
Yep.
There wasn't much food stored in the emergency store cupboard, was there?
There wasn't, no.
And what did they eat every day?
They had 3 days emergency rations, and that kept them going 17 days. And the thing that was really tricky to begin with is the miners who arrived in the refuge early, that's the sort of designated safe space, some had helped themselves to a bit of the emergency rations. So of course in the later days, a couple of weeks later, when they're down to half a teaspoonful of tuna a day per man, you think you could be looking at your brother thinking, well, you had that cookie 2 weeks ago. We could be having that now. So the potential for conflict when you're starving was so high. And that's what I loved about the story, is that those sort of little moments of bitterness were just forgiven.
Yes.
And they were like, look, we're going to...
Yeah, so instead of conflict, Dan, there was confession.
Yes, very good.
Which is interesting,
exactly.
Isn't it?
Confession and compassion.
And compassion,
yeah. Very
now,
good.
what about water then? Tell us about those 2 tanks.
Yeah, amazing. So they had water in industrial tanks for cooling the machines, but of course they were laced with chemicals. They were obviously polluted. No one wanted to drink them. But Jose said, well, we'll just pray for them. So he prayed a blessing over this tank. I mean, if they're going to die first anyway, they thought we might as well have a go. And they drank the water. They were completely fine. And then later on, when they tested the water quality in that tank, it was completely clean. But the other tank, the tank that Jose didn't pray for, was contaminated. And so at that moment, they thought, oh, wow, something's going on here. And there was those little stories, those little moments where, like I say, you can't explain that. And it could be coincidence, but actually when those coincidences keep adding up, you have to wonder.
And then there are other little stories within the story. You know how the president of Chile went to visit his father-in-law who was dying quite late in the night. And what did his father-in-law tell him?
Well, this is remarkable, J.John, because when you're in the depths of a mine, of course you're praying, but the president didn't need to have, he could have quite easily left this.
Because it was a private mine.
Exactly.
Yes.
And he first of all, he said he had a real conviction that they were alive. And then obviously after 2 weeks, all his advisors are saying, come on, you've got to give this up. And you're right, absolutely right. He went to see his father-in-law, who was very sick. And his father-in-law said, look, they're alive. You've got to keep looking for them. And the father-in-law was in his deathbed. So the president, Piñera, spoke to his wife in the morning and said, I had this unusual conversation with your dad last night. And his wife said, this means something. So he got on a plane and went up to the mine that day, and that was the day they found them.
Yes.
And the president walked up just as they brought up that note from the mine.
The note to
saying that all well, the 33. The timing was sublime.
It's incredible.
Yeah. And the president was very honest about his, you've got to remember, he's a political figure and there's a Christian sort of sympathy, but it's unusual for a leader to be given the glory to God. He could have taken some kudos for himself, deservedly so, because he was pursuing them. But he was very honest about the fact there was something in this story beyond him, beyond the government, beyond the drilling teams, who were all amazing. But actually there was something in this story that was someone was kind of choreographing it, shall we say.
Yes.
And he was happy to admit that and celebrate it.
And then as they were getting the prisoners out, they sent down T-shirts. Yeah. And what was it? Can you remember what was on the front and the back?
They had Psalm 95. I can't remember the quote. Something like in the depths of the earth, the mountains are in your hands, and in the depths of the earth, something like that. Yes. You can check it out. Psalm 95, and it just had Jesus written on the sleeve.
So
on the front,
it said, out.
It was Gracias, Señor. Thank you, Lord. Just written on the front. Because they wanted to say that this is the message we're taking from the mine. Thank you, Lord. Gracias, Señor. Yes. And Jose said this to me. He said, we don't want this story to sort of be hijacked and become just another story of they were very lucky or the drilling teams were very good. That's all true. He says the real glory goes to God. And he was really passionate to say that, Jose. He said the hero of his story is Jesus Christ, not man.
So having met the miners in person and heard the story in person, what impact did that have on you?
I would say I was inspired by their sort of the calmness and the peace and the trust, particularly from Jose, because actually the chances of them surviving were very, very slim. And actually every day they were in the mine, the mountain was sort of grumbling around them. It could have collapsed at any second and they're all being crushed. That's an incredibly high pressure environment to be in. Besides the fact they're running out of food and water, it was so stressful. And despite that, the only thing that held him together was this faith. He wasn't, his circumstances were terrible, but he was like, I know God's going to rescue us. And so the thing that inspired me was that there was a level of peace that you can have in your relationship with God, which is completely outside of circumstances. Actually, there's a deep place of connection, and you can change the atmosphere around you with that. And Jose really brought real peace to the mine. And I thought, well, if that's possible there in this traumatic situation, it's possible anywhere.
Absolutely. Wow. Okay, you then go on, you tell that story, and then you go on and on another journey.
That's
and
right.
Tell another story. A walk from Egypt to Nazareth. Okay, when did that come to you? Did you wake up one morning and think, I'm going to walk 500 miles through the desert?
Well, it's almost like that. So I'd say, first of all, like my background is I grew up in a very secular world. My friends are mostly atheists, and I have a real sympathy for the secular world. When people ask me difficult questions as a Christian, I often think, good question. I don't know, And particularly what we talked about the media, I think if you've got no Christian friends or any exposure to the gospel, you've never been on an Alpha course, all you know is from kind of what you pick up from the papers, I think, why would you believe? And I think I really want to show people what it looks like to be a follower of Jesus through these testimonies, but also want to sort of invite people into Jesus' life. And I know from past experience, when you start to talk about faith, they just think, I don't know, this is awkward, particularly the British. And I thought, well, if I walk Jesus' actual journey, as a refugee child in exile in Egypt, probably one of his first memories would have been his journey home, all the way from Egypt up to Nazareth. And actually then I can invite people into his life, not a sort of set of religious teachings, but his journey through the desert, dodging walls, trying to get water, trying to survive as a refugee, like any refugee in this generation on a big journey. Jesus knew that world, and I wanted to sort of step into that, and in doing so, explore his life and sort of invite people into those first vulnerable years.
500 miles?
Yeah.
How many days did it take you to walk it?
It took about 3 months, but I did stop off and I stayed with some people on the way in Jerusalem, in Bethlehem, and different desert towns.
Right.
So I didn't walk every day.
No, so 3 months. You had some companions for some of the journey, but then there were days you were on your own.
Yeah.
Were you not concerned?
I was, yeah.
Were you not fearful?
Very fearful. And that's when the rubber hits the road. I mean, having faith when you're surrounded by people supporting you is easy enough. It's not easy enough, I still struggle then. But actually, it was the day when I had a friend called Pete who joined me on the first sort of frontier. Brilliant guy, really helpful. And then he had to go back because he had to go back to work. And that first night alone in the wilderness.
So you're in the desert, and he's got to go back to work. So how does he go on a detour?
So there's a road kind of running up, but we were leaving the road and going up into the mountains. So literally, he went one way, back down to civilization, and got the bus up, and I went the other way up into the mountains, away from civilization.
On your own?
Yeah, on my own. And I remember saying to God beforehand, I'm praying about this, and I'm like, I'll do this for you and for this story, but I'm not doing it by myself.
Yes.
And you know what? Sometimes you tell God what He's going to do, and He's like, "I think you'll find I'm God." And and as it was, I was by myself. But you know what? I feel like there was something important in making part of a journey alone. I wouldn't change it for the world, because for 2 reasons. One, actually, the first night I spent alone in the wilderness, that was the day when the Prime Minister was holding his reception in Downing Street to tackle the loneliness epidemic in the West. And I thought, well, that is good timing. Now, I'm experiencing loneliness, but actually, for me, being alone in the desert for a couple of weeks, that is almost like a sort of living metaphor of what it's like for millions of people, particularly during the last year we've had isolating, quarantine, living alone. And I started to explore what is the cure to this sort of loneliness epidemic. And I found two things. One, I found communities, partly the community I left behind in Bristol, that I realised in that time how much I loved them, when you were alone. But also I found communities in the desert who would take me in, Jewish communities, and later on the West Bank, Palestinian communities, Christians, Jews, Muslims, old, young, all sorts of different people from different walks of life who just took me in. That sort of Middle Eastern hospitality, and treated me like a brother, and rescued me and gave me some food.
So when they found you in the middle of the desert, were they like, who are you?
Yeah, quite.
Where have you come from?
And there is a sort of trail that some hikers walk. So it was kind of known, but I was doing it out of season. And it's not, the desert's dangerous. And so not many people travel alone. and I was a Christian, so they don't meet many Christians. I was just interesting to people.
Yes.
In January, no one's around.
And
so
how did you communicate?
So actually, you can text ahead to people on this forum and say, I'm coming into your village. And Israel's incredible. It's in the desert, it's very hard to get water. You're completely on your own, surrounded by wild animals, but you can still text. And so it's a very unusual world where actually physically it's very hostile, but it's amazing. You can get signal. I mean, that's the 21st century.
It is.
But still, even then, you can't guarantee. There was one time I was in a valley, I'd lost signal, I was on my own, and that's when you have to pray, because whatever mod cons you've got, sometimes they fail. So that's the first thing I'd say, as I had communities that looked after me. I'm very grateful for trail angels, they call them.
Yeah, so they welcomed you,
amazing.
Fed you.
Yeah, exactly how it would have been for Jesus.
And you sat around the fire.
Exactly, yeah. And Jesus' stories are filled with those sort of tales of hospitality. And so I experienced that. I was the stranger that turned up in the middle of a night and they looked after. But I'd also say I experienced something in my own relationship with God, which was something that I think human contact can't quite fulfill. We need community, we need each other. But there was a place, I think Augustine said, our hearts are restless until they find their rest in him. And there was one particular day, I mentioned I was in that valley, the valley of a shadow of death, literally, like David wrote in Psalm 23. And I lost my phone signal, I was off the map, I was taking a shortcut, which had gone terribly wrong, like most of my shortcuts as a geography teacher. And I reached this sort of polished slab of rock at the end of this ravine. It's the sort of epicenter of a previous flash flood. And I thought, I'm going to have to climb up this. And I was running low on water. I knew there was walls behind me. I had to get to the top. Lots of things started to converge. I'm like, I'm in a bit of trouble here. And this is when things go wrong in the desert. There's desert rescuers further north who said, look, people get lost, they fall down. And the sort of margins of survival in the desert are very slim. If something goes wrong, that's it, So I started to pray, okay, God, I've got nothing. I've got no one to call. I've got no one around me. I really need you. And I wouldn't say I'm not that experienced in the prophetic, I'm not like John the Baptist, but actually when you need to, God turns up. And I was about to climb the slab and I felt so strongly this conviction turn back. I just couldn't do it. My legs felt like cement. It felt like I was being disobedient. And when I turned back, I felt like God just saying, well done. And I started to sort of pray my way down this valley, like left, right, and I felt like God leading me to the left. And this is totally new to me. Like I say, I'm not a prophet, but I needed God, and I said, look, help. And I followed his leading, left, right, and he led me to this little path, and it kind of looped up the valley, across this slab, and then there was a path going up the ridge. If I hadn't taken that, I might not be here now. So I think it taught me as a place of connection where you cry out to God when you really need him. And there's a part of your soul that God wants to meet you in, that nothing else, no human contact, no gadgets, no sort of mod cons. There's a place in our soul which is built for God, and I found him in that place. Just like David said, in the valley of the shadow of death, you are with me, and that's enough.
And God definitely guides our steps and he guides our stops.
Exactly,
and
very
it's always
good.
like he stopped you, didn't he?
Yeah.
And redirected your steps.
Yeah, very good.
That was very moving.
Yeah.
What I was so intrigued about with your book, Dan, Finding the Peacemakers, is that you tell the story about the miners in Chile. You then walk through the desert, 500 miles, and then you end with. You tell another story which seems completely random, but actually, when you put the three stories together, what is so brilliant about them is that it's three angles.
Yeah.
You're looking at three different things that actually, there are so many connected principles with all three. But you tell the story of a football hooligan.
That's right, yeah.
So, first of all, right, when you're thinking, okay, I'm going to put together Finding the Peacemakers, Chile sounds amazing, the desert sounds amazing. Oh, I'll slip in a story about a football hooligan.
Yeah.
How did your brain work that one out?
Well, to be honest, J.John, I don't want to take the credit for it, because partly I feel like the doors that God opened almost felt like he was writing the script. And he was kind of leading me like this one next, then this one. And I was sort of following along, and I had some ideas that didn't work. And I just felt like there was a golden thread running through them of exactly, as you say, of peacemaking. And actually, as much as the Chilean miners were amazing, and that's the sort of wow factor story, and the other stories, I met all sorts of different people, Syrian refugees, and some amazing, powerful sort of miracle stories. But I did think, actually, it can be quite easy when stories are a long way away geographically. You can think, well, that's out there. How does it affect me? And I really wanted to capture something in my own hometown, in Bristol, in Western culture. And actually, I knew Dave. He came to do a talk when I was a teacher. He was a chaplain to Bristol Rovers at the time, and I thought at the time, this guy's amazing. Partly because knowing his backstory, and he was a wild child, and he was a football hooligan, and he wasn't very nice by his own admission. And when you meet him today, he is the most, I'd say, bravely loving. He's not just kind of like a tender sort of person. He hasn't lost his grit, but his grit is now loving. So he will fight for people rather than against them.
He's like a cuddly teddy bear.
Exactly. Exactly.
But he was a serious hooligan.
Yeah.
I mean, he got arrested for beating up opposition fans, didn't he?
100%, yeah. And I wanted to tell that story because I think peacemaking isn't just something that happens in war zones. Like, we all need peacemaking. We all have conflicts. We all have fractions of people in ourselves and with other people. And actually, we're not all football hooligans, but we all have little moments of fraction. And I feel like he could show us what it looks like to reach out, not just to those around you who are a bit different to you, but your actual enemies.
Yes.
And he reached out to a guy in a rival gang. And it's quite a funny story. He'd found faith and left that whole world behind him. But he was in hospital visiting family, and he saw this other guy, a guy called Divvy, Mark Divvy Saunders, on the bed opposite. And Divvy was with the Bristol City guys, and Dave was Bristol Rovers. It's the same in any town. You're red or blue, right? You're north or south. And he was the rival team. And Divvy sort of clocked him, and he looked at him, and they kind of had that, "You all right, mate?"
Yeah.
And
Dave they knew.
Thought, oh yeah, Dave thought, just don't go there. But he's a vicar now, and so before he'd gone over with a fist, now he's like, I'm going to go over there and pray for him. And he went over and kind of said, "You all right, mate?" And Divvy's kind of working out but he's obviously lying in bed. He's in hospital. He's had a tumour removed, so they can't fight. And they start chatting, and Divvy's probably going to work out what's this guy doing. And Dave said, I'm a vicar now. And Divvy lost it. He's like, "What? You are a vicar? You've got to be kidding." So Dave shared his story a bit about how he came to faith. He shared this moment when he'd gone to church he didn't like church. He went because he'd gone with a girl who had sort of bribed him to come to church and would go for a drink afterwards. He'd really experienced the power of God in that church. Someone prayed for him, and it just knocked him out. And he had just left a life of violence in one moment. And if it wasn't for the story of Paul, Paul of Tarsus on the road to Damascus, knocked down, and a lifetime of persecution in the church became a lifetime of being a preacher. Like, Dave had exactly that experience. It was a real Damascus Road experience. And so he said to Divvy, "I can pray that for you." And Divvy was like, "Well, nothing to lose. This guy that used to knock me out is now offering to pray for me." He prayed for Divvy, and Divvy said exactly the same. This warm, he said it was like electricity flowing from my body, just warmth, the love of God just entered his body. And just like that, they became friends, arch rivals. And then he ended up baptizing Divvy. When Divvy later died, Dave did his funeral, and there was these Rovers and City guys in church meeting because these two, that's like a genuine Good Samaritan story. These two arch rivals, now friends, met, who had prayed for one another.
Yes.
Like, that's the kind of stories that are happening in our cities.
Yes.
It's not just in war zones and other places.
No.
There is peacemaking, and there's love, and there's countercultural stuff, that's happening right here and now. And I wanted people to see it, and almost to say, well, what could I do in my city? Who could I go and meet on the other side of the street?
Absolutely. And what's so amazing, you got this man who is a serious hooligan, who is banned by the football club.
Yeah.
Who then becomes the chaplain
exactly.
to the football club.
Yeah.
I mean, that in itself.
And he said that, so they invited him back in, and he said, "Look, I've been banned. Like, my history." And they said, "Yeah, we know your history." And they said, "We need people like you to show for the other guys that there's the opportunity to change." And actually, his story had in it that redemptive edge. And then other hooligans could say, well, Dave was like that, and now he's our chaplain. That almost gives people the permission, who are in a bit of a pickle themselves, to say, well, if he can do it, he becomes a role model. Often with these sort of stories, you don't need to sort of explain to people, here's your route out of hooliganism. You can just say, well, look, here's Dave's story. And you think, well, if he can do it, I can do it. And for a lot of young lads in prison, in the football, he's now a Navy chaplain, a lot of sort of tough guys. I think often in tough guys, there's a tenderness underneath that the sort of macho people put on a front. But deep inside, there's a tender spirit that's asking the same questions as everyone else. Is there a God? What's my purpose? Am I going to die? And Dave is exactly the right person for those sort of tough guys, because he's a tough guy himself, but he's also happy to ask the questions, to pray the prayers, and he has a peace that I think people crave. And so they lean on Dave. He's led all sorts of people to faith. He's prayed for all sorts of people. Often the toughest people who are put on a front, in a quiet moment, they come to Dave and say, "Can we pray?"
Yes, absolutely.
And he's there for them.
You're very much like an investigative journalist, Dan, aren't you? And you kind of like looked into the details of the Chilean miners. You looked into the details of doing that walk across the desert. You looked into detail about Dave's story. So as you consider those three powerful stories that you talk in detail in your book, Finding the Peacemakers, what's it done to you?
The thing is, you're absolutely right. I love searching out stories and finding the details. I think for me, it's awakened in me this passion to find out the sort of, I don't want to say the answers to the sort of issues at the moment, because I think the answers are in the stories. It's inspired me to find the sort of role models in this generation who can provide almost a way through. I think in this generation, it's so noisy. There's so much opinion, so many issues, so much politics, so much conflict. You know, the amount of information we consume is almost overwhelming. And actually, I think this generation is just bewildered. You know, who do you listen to? How does it work? And I love finding someone who can just show the way. They're not like preaching or practicing or ranting or shouting. They're just living their life in such a way that people think, oh, that's the way out. And they're not flustered. You know, I think people of peace in this generation are quite rare. And so for me, it's made me want to show this generation, who are these people? Who are the peacemakers? Who are the people who are turning the other cheek? Who are the other people who really trust God when the rubber hits the road?
Yeah. And there are peacemakers out there, and there are good stories that actually need to be told.
And when you hear them, I think that's what gives people the inspiration to follow it. Often, I think a lot of people work by imitation. You see something, you think, I can do that. And so I wanted to create those stories that kind of almost invite people into the movement. And the other thing I'd say about these people is they're all ordinary people. They're not superheroes. You know, Dave will be very honest about his backstory. You know, the Chilean miners were very honest about their fears in the mine. They're not superheroes, they're just people who have put their trust in God, who've taken a risk, who've depended on Him day by day, and God has done things through their lives, you know, and He's empowered them day by day. And it's the same for all of us, you know, this journey wasn't written just like that. You know, there was little moments where, is this right, God? I'm not sure. And things might have kind of fallen apart at the last minute. There was definitely moments in the desert when I thought, why am I doing this? But actually, there's just day by day trusting God. Those days add up. And then over the course of your life, He can do all sorts of things. It's amazing.
Dan, thank you for telling these stories in your book, Finding the Peacemakers. You're a great storyteller. Look forward to volume 2.
Yeah.
Thank you for joining us on Facing the Canon.
Oh, thank you, J.John.
I really hope those stories that Dan has just told us, I hope they've given you a faith lift. I hope they've inspired you with a little bit more faith, hope, and love. Thank you very much for joining us on Facing the Canon.